beginning, the Bureau was going to target criminality wherever it was found. White-collar crime had been very successful in making people rich. It had been a criticism of various people over the years that the white-collar criminals were running amok and nothing was happening.
White-collar crime is as deadly and as nefarious as any type of crime. How many people have lost their life savings, lost their property? Their way of life has been completely changed because of these fraudsters. And just because a fella has a suit and a collar and tie, he speaks well, doesn't make him any less a criminal than the person who goes out and grabs a handbag, assaults somebody, or commits a burglary.
It is said that power in the wrong hands corrupts. Ray Burke and Michael Keating were once high flyers. Burke was the senior minister in 5 Fianna Fáil governments. Michael Keating too rose to the top. He was once the Minister for Sport. He also served a term as Dublin's Lord Mayor. Both men abused their power and the people's trust and ended up on the wrong side of the law. Both were exposed and shamed by the Criminal Assets Bureau. Michael Keating's fall from grace was an indirect result of the Bureau's decision to set up a team to track down the assets of one of the country's biggest godfathers. That man was the Penguin, George Mitchell. Mitchell fled to Amsterdam after CAB was set up in 1996. From here, he rebuilt his criminal network and continued to flood Ireland with drugs. Operation Firedamp began in 1997 and would in time shed light on the shadowy alliances between business, politics and organised crime. George Mitchell doesn't like to attract any kind of attention, which explains why he lives here in a modest little house on the outskirts of Amsterdam. It's hard to think of it, but this is the nerve centre of a major international drug empire.
When the legislation came in, a lot of criminals, including Georgie Mitchell, took steps to remove their assets from Ireland, and therefore he removed his assets and also his whole base to Amsterdam. He has run a very successful international drug trafficking operation here and has supplied Ireland with drugs on many, many occasions. He runs it like a business. He's very, very careful, and he has this armchair approach, hands off. Rarely gets his hands dirty himself.
For almost 20 years now, George Mitchell has played a leading role in running drugs into Ireland and Britain. But he's also been up to his fat neck in major robberies and arms smuggling. One of his biggest customers was the Provisional IRA. To keep that criminal machine ticking over, the Penguin Mitchell has relied on a number of plausible and respectable frontmen at home.
During the CAB investigation into the finances of George Mitchell, we identified a person who we would recall as a white-collar criminal. His name was Peter Bolger.
Bolger would be a long-time criminal operating in Dublin as a conman. His nickname in the criminal world was the Banker, and that was his role. His role was to deal with money matters.
You must remember that all crime bosses, they may well be able to control the movement of firearms and the distribution of drugs and generating a vast amount of profit. They need the Peter Bolgers to create a smokescreen and thereby conceal their assets. That was Mr. Bolger's forte.
The team uncovered a huge amount of evidence which disclosed that Bolger had managed monies quite extensively in and out of the jurisdiction.
Originally from Crumlin in South Dublin, Peter Edward Bolger was a typical conman. Confident and suave, he cultivated the air of a successful and respectable businessman. In 1996, he had been convicted of a major commercial fraud in London, but the wily banker had skipped bail and returned to Dublin before he could be locked up. Bolger was always on the lookout not only for a scam, but for someone plausible and maybe even a little naive enough to front it for him. Enter Michael Keating, a failed politician who didn't seem to care how he got rich, just as long as he did. Keating worked as a teacher and a journalist before going into politics. He portrayed the image of a guy who was flash, brash and going places, or so he thought. As Lord Mayor, Keating loved the limelight, but felt his status was not adequately rewarded. To those who would listen, he constantly moaned about the size of his allowance as Dublin's first citizen.
I've absolutely no doubt but that his motivation going into politics was a moderately good one, service to the community and so on. He was ambitious. I think he wanted to rise through the ranks.
I think that more and more people are aware of the problems of trying to achieve world peace.
He said all the right things. You know, he appeared to care about all the right things, but personally I'd have to say I found him to be a bit of a butterfly. He seemed to move from one issue to another very quickly.
One day he got the bright idea of purchasing the prestigious Adair Manor in County Limerick for the benefit of the Irish taxpayer. Without telling his colleagues in government, or even his Taoiseach Garret Fitzgerald, he requisitioned an army helicopter to fly to Adair to seal the deal. But before pen was put to paper, he was stopped in his tracks, forced to retreat, and ordered to report to Garret Fitzgerald for a reprimand.
The next time he really came into the limelight was after the Progressive Democrats were set up.
I'm confident that there is great support available for a new initiative in Irish politics.
They were fishing around other parties to get members. To the best of my recollection, Michael was actually on the 1 o'clock news on RTE one day saying that he was not going to become a member of the PDs, and at about 2:30 he'd announced that he had joined the PDs. That didn't endear him to anybody in Fine Gael.
In 1987, when Des O'Malley looked like the political messiah of the time, Michael Keating became deputy leader of the Progressive Democrats.
It's an extraordinary way to advance one's career, to leave what might be constituted by some to be a relatively safe seat and join a small fledgling party.
But when power and office initially eluded the PDs, without warning, Keating jumped ship and rejoined Fine Gael, only to flop at the polls in the 1992 election. No longer trusted in politics, he was now cast adrift, but he was aching to get back to the big time. Keating then had the bright idea of acquiring the Irish franchise for an obscure Chinese cure for baldness. When that idea receded, he became a novelist. Ironically enough, Charlie Haughey launched his first and only book, Day of Reckoning. The blurb promised the reader a shocking and thrilling account of the crime of the century. Keating then tried to sell what he claimed were the secret black diaries of Michael Collins to Neil Jordan. The movie maker passed on the idea, and the manuscript, which depicted the big fella as a rampant homosexual, disappeared from the market.
The story about the secret diaries of Michael Collins came, I have to say, much later as a bolt out of the blue to me. He certainly never spoke to me about it. I think there's a kind of a Walter Mitty element about that story that seems very, very odd. As far as I've heard, he never actually produced anything that looked like the diaries. This was all seems to have been in his mind. I don't know what was behind that, but it was a totally fanciful episode.
It seems the prodigal politician was now at his wit's end. A loser in politics, a loser in business, but still driven by a desire to make it big. Somehow, somewhere, Michael Keating found himself in the company of Peter Bolger, the gangster's bagman. Bolger would drag his new best friend, Keating, down into the vortex of the underworld, a sordid universe ruled by George the Penguin Mitchell. Fianna Fáil's Ray Burke, or Rambo as he was known in political circles, was also up to no good. Hiding in open view as a minister in successive governments, Burke betrayed his seal of office at every opportunity. Far from representing the people, Burke was looking out for number one. Raphael Burke exuded power and menace in equal measure. An auctioneer by profession, Burke had already amassed a suspicious degree of wealth and affluence before he entered Leinster House in 1973. As a county councillor, he was to emerge as a key figure in the development of the satellite towns that would spring up in rural North and West Dublin. A man instrumental in the making of modern Ireland, for better and for worse. There were good grounds for suspecting Burke. As an auctioneer, he was close to builders and developers. One journalist discovered he was too close and tried to expose him. Back in the 1970s, Joe McAnthony was gaining a reputation for himself as a campaigning reporter. On the scent of skullduggery in North County Dublin, he thought he hit pay dirt on Ray Burke and developers Tom Brennan and Joseph McGowan.
I went into the company's office. I looked for any companies he was involved with. And I was carrying a big bundle across the company's office of these files. And out of them a page fell, and it was a page in which it said, Ray Burke for professional services, £15,000. So here was the company that had gotten planning permission, paying him for professional planning advice, and Ray Burke was the one who got it rezoned. And I mean, it was so naked. We published it. I thought, we have him. There is no question about it. The policeman who came to interview me about it said to me, forget it, no, he'll never go to jail. Nothing's going to come out of this.
Some of the basic information was documents which appeared in the company's office disclosing monies paid to Ray Burke. When the guards became alerted to this because of publicity from a newspaper article, the documents had been removed from the company's office file. But for the fact that the journalist had taken the opportunity to copy the documents, there would have been no proof of that, but there's proof positive that the documents were there.
For exposing Burke as a politician on the make, Joe McAnthony got scant reward. Discarded by his own newspaper, the Sunday Independent, and shunned by RTE after signing a contract with the station, McAnthony was forced to leave Ireland and start a new life in Canada. Ray Burke was interrogated on 20 occasions by the police, and each time spoofed as only he could spoof. Without the powers, or indeed the will, to go after the money trail, the fraud squad was stymied. Burke was free to carry on ripping off the Irish public for the benefit of himself and his cronies.
The legislation was never really there to deal with white-collar crime over the years. Elements of proof were too difficult, and those of our members who came up through the fraud squad the years gone by had that added difficulty, first of all to arrest people, then to get evidence, and then to bring them before the court.
The Garda fraud detectives investigated the matter as far as they possibly could go. However, no case was ever made to substantiate bringing charges against Mr. Burke.
And there it rested for over 20 years. In the meantime, Burke built a glittering and corrupt career, but he left a paper trail that one day would prove to be his downfall. By the mid-80s, Dublin County Council was notorious for its bizarre planning decisions. Councillors had the power to grant so-called Section 4 applications to developers. This enabled builders to rezone cheap agricultural land and become multi-millionaires overnight. At the centre of all this haggling was Ray Burke, who chaired the council meetings and made sure his secret sponsors got the biggest slice of the action.
Ray Burke was clearly a very strong character, a very strong presence. You could feel that he was the kind of person who would impose himself on the company he was with. I had heard about his operations as a member of Dublin County Council. You would hear stories of the atmosphere in which Various decisions, and planning decisions in particular, were made there, and the influence that Ray Burke seemed to be exercising. There were very strong suspicions that something amiss was going on.
I'd be in a supermarket along with my family, and this was true for a lot of politicians in different parties. Any brown envelopes today, Rory? Or, the snide remarks, that if one politician is corrupt, then sure, they're all the same. Everybody's at it. What do you expect? And I found that and find it deeply offensive.
I spoke to one person who came to see me about this, and I said, well, look, there's no point just telling me. We have to bring this to the guards, who are the only authorities who can do anything with this. And he wouldn't do that. He said, well, if I do that, I have to admit that I myself have committed a crime in actually paying a bribe. And there was just no way of getting him to change his mind about that. So you were in the frustrating position of almost having information that could produce some kind of result, but not being able to use it.
By the late 1980s, Fianna Fáil were back in government, and once more, Burke was at the centre of power. Charles Haughey named him Minister for Communications and rendered him untouchable by appointing him Justice Minister at the same time. We now know that Burke was bribed to help the new national commercial station, Century Radio, compete with RTE. We also know that Burke was pocketing money given to him for Fianna Fáil. What we didn't know was that he was using his influence to keep tabs on all investigations into his own breaches of the law.
Under a corrupt Minister for Justice, there were few Garda careers to be advanced going after the man at the top. In fact, Burke abused his power by poring over old Garda files on himself and his cronies. The administration of law and order in Ireland now lay in this man's hands.
Very much after the fact, some of those papers, very particular papers, dealing with Ray Burke's own case, the investigation into him, were found in his house. Now, it's an outrageous proposition that the suspect could have access to the Garda file. Now, it's not known how or when he got the file from the ministry, but you would have a strong suspicion that he got it from at the time when he was minister.
Despite the aura of office, Ray Burke could never quite shed his thuggish wide boy reputation. Just like his sleazy boss, Charlie Haughey, the rumours of his corrupt descent never went away. Albert Reynolds sacked Burke when he replaced Haughey in 1992, but when Bertie Ahern became Taoiseach for the first time in 1997, Burke was back, this time in the plum job of foreign affairs.
When Ray Burke was appointed Foreign Minister in 1997, there was a palpable feeling of shock and surprise in the Dáil, certainly among the opposition. And I've no doubt that there were a few people surprised in Fianna Fáil also. There was a developing storm of controversy and question and allegation and denial. And as it went on, the whole thing began to appear more and more shoddy, more and more corrosive of what a parliament should be.
In fact, it got so corrosive, the Dáil could no longer ignore the stench. A tribunal of inquiry into planning matters arose out of a dispute within the building company JMSE. James Gogarty, a cranky old engineer with a grievance over his pension, wanted to get revenge against his former employers. Gogarty accused the company's principals, Joseph Murphy Sr. and Jr., of bribing politicians to rezone land. He singled out Ray Burke as the man he'd witnessed getting £80,000 in Burke's home, Briargate, on the morning of the 1989 general election. Burke, as usual, bluffed and blustered. But the heat got so intense, the Fianna Fáil PD coalition set up an inquiry into James Gogarty's allegations.
I've come here today to defend my personal integrity, the integrity of my party, of this government, and the honour of this House. I've also come here to reassure the public, and in particular my constituents, that I have done nothing wrong.
You cannot use evidence that's given before a tribunal in a court of law. You've got to start from scratch.
For the record, I have never done any favours for or made any representations to anyone on behalf of JMSE, either before or since 1989.
However, there is a great benefit in that as a result of tribunals, you get a pointer as to where things are and what has happened and where you can search.
Whatever comes out of the woodwork from now on, the line is in the sand. As far as I'm concerned, from this day on is D-Day. I move on.
But the sands shifted and Burke resigned from public life in October 1997. Taoiseach Bertie Ahern never wavered in his support of Burke. He said he had been up every tree in North Dublin to check out the credentials of his political friend. And Bertie stood by him again in Burke's darkest hour.
I deeply regret that Deputy Ray Burke has resigned, not only his ministerial office but his Dáil seat. I believe he resigned both as the strongest protest that he could make at the shameful treatment to which he was subjected by certain parties in this House and by certain sections of the media who cynically regard politics simply as a blood sport.
Bertie's loyalty to Burke would be flung back in his face. Burke walked away from public life with not only a cloud over his head, but with money belonging to Fianna Fáil bulging in his pocket. He banked on sitting out the storm, and when he was summoned to the tribunal, true to form, he lied through his teeth. However, far from the glare of the cameras and the press pack, Burke became the focus of a Criminal Assets Bureau investigation. A quiet search began for the old files, and old, long-hidden skeletons began to rattle in dusty cupboards.
He became a target because he was suspected of corruption, and he became a target because of the information that the Bureau had about the monies he had obtained over the years that were A, not disclosed, and B, not justified. The Criminal Assets Bureau had to conduct its own inquiries and to gather its own evidence, and would not have received any material from the tribunal.
The fact that it was Mr. Ray Burke, former Minister of Justice, yes, it impinged on the importance of the case. It was a major case, highly sensitive, highly political. I would have regarded the investigation into Ray Burke as top secret.
When the tribunal's report into Gogarty's allegations was published in September 2002, Mr. Justice Fergus Flood ruled that Burke was the recipient of corrupt payments going back 30 years. He found that Burke's company, Caviar Limited, was the vehicle for the lodging of bribes in accounts in the Isle of Man and Jersey. Rambo had finally been rumbled, but he was to lose a lot more than his reputation.
The tribunal findings showed the reality. Somebody in a position of power who was deliberately misusing that power to enrich himself.
It was a combination of power and greed, I would have said. A combination of the exercise of power and the belief that if you were in power, this was part of your remuneration. But I don't think it was ever anticipated until late in the day that he was going to be made accountable.
Spooked by the tribunal's findings, Ray Burke moved to cash in an Arc Life insurance policy. With £87,000 loaded into his car, he headed off to Holyhead. He remained in England for over a month, and to this day, mystery surrounds his activities during that period. The cab was immediately tipped off by Arc Life. Such a large transaction bore all the hallmarks of illegal money laundering. An emergency summit was convened in Garda headquarters, and the decision was reached to go after Ray Burke with no holds barred.
I had no difficulty making the decision and recommending to the Commissioner of the day that this was a suitable case for investigation.
I never in my life, in making a decision, considered whether the person came from one strata of society or the other. If we come to a stage that we have to kind of consider whether we should do A or B because a person comes from one particular background or was a past office holder, then we are not serving the people of this country well.
The decision to invoke the powers given to the CAB by the legislation was, I think, a significant decision in that it was a clear statement that political position was not going to shield that person in any way from the application of the law.
There was a belief at the time among the investigators that there had been money obtained by political corruption, and we were expected to follow it as best we could. Didn't matter how high you were up the food chain.
Nor did it matter how far the high and mighty had fallen, as Burke's political foe Michael Keating was to discover.
Even street corner thugs now have guns, and they're prepared to use them.
As Ray Burke faced his moment of truth, former Lord Mayor Michael Keating had found himself entangled in the sinister schemes of crime boss George Mitchell. The Criminal Assets Bureau team charged with hunting the Penguin discovered that his bagman Peter Bolger had recruited Keating into their conspiracy.
When Michael Keating was befriended by Peter Bolger, Peter Bolger was trying to create an illusion to foreign investors, let it be in Europe or Africa or Eastern Europe. He needed a public representative and a public face from Ireland. He identified Michael Keating as that person, and he was wheeled in to represent Ireland as a former Lord Mayor and as a major politician, a person who can get things done in Ireland.
We discovered that Michael Keating was actually involved in transporting monies and bank drafts made payable to George Mitchell in circumstances which were most surprising to the investigators.
2 bank drafts worth £50,000 and payable to a G. Mitchell were moved by Keating to the AIB branch in Terenure. And from here, he transferred funds to the client account of Peter Bolger's solicitor, Gabriel Houghton, in Dunleary. On Peter Bolger's instructions, up to £200,000 was ultimately switched from the Ulster Bank in Dunleary to an account in the Isle of Man, which was controlled by Bolger on behalf of gang boss George Mitchell. Keating, wittingly or not, had helped the Penguin get his dirty money out of the country and away from the clutches of the Criminal Assets Bureau.
I frankly find it difficult to understand how he got enmeshed with criminal activity.
I don't know the full answer for that. It may be a lack of discernment on my part after I left politics and became perhaps involved or partially involved in business with people. I don't know.
There was probably a degree of flattery of him by people who buttered him up by suggesting that they believed he had a lot of influence and that appealed to his vanity, and he got sucked in that way.
The truth, I suppose, is that, bad things do happen to good people sometimes. In everyone's life, a shadow now and again can fall.
He was dealing in the middle of con artists, and he was dealing in the middle of serious money laundering of drug money. And I would say that at the beginning, his ego was put forward that he was going to be an ambassador in foreign countries with these people. And up to a certain stage, he probably, I wouldn't like to try and whitewash it, up to a certain stage, he was probably conned himself. But there came a stage when he should have gone to the guards, and he didn't.
Keating didn't go to the guards. Instead, the guards came to Keating.
When the Criminal Assets Bureau closed in on him, I felt, I have to say, a bit sad that somebody that I'd known in politics and who had been a colleague was now in that position.
I worked out an arrangement with officers of the authorities involved in this matter, whom I found almost to a man to be respectful and to have done a good job and a fair job, and against whom I have no quibble whatever.
When he had the opportunity to get out and come clean, he didn't quite do that. He said he was doing it, but he didn't do it. And that to my mind, impacted on what view I would take of how or deep he was involved or why he was involved.
Michael Keating had to be arrested on suspicion of money laundering because Up to until then, he was unhelpful in respect of the investigation.
In September 1997, the officer in charge of the Operation Fire Damp investigation, Detective Sergeant Paul O'Brien, arrested Keating at his palatial home in Castleknock. The former Lord Mayor was taken to Pearse Street Garda Station, where he was questioned over a 2-day period. After 2 days in custody, Keating signed a self-serving statement and literally tried to sob his way out of trouble. He blamed his predicament on Bolger and claimed he couldn't even bear to look at a mugshot of George Mitchell.
During that detention, he made statements of his involvement with Peter Bolger and the work he had carried out for him. He was apologetic for the fact that he allowed himself to be taken control of by Bolger on behalf of George Mitchell.
In the beginning, certainly, you could give him the benefit of the doubt and come to a conclusion that he himself was also being fooled. But after a certain stage, I don't accept that.
Unlike Keating, Peter Bolger didn't fold without a fight. With Mitchell and other underworld bosses bankrolling him, he tried to turn the tables on Cab and launched several legal challenges against him in the courts. Bolger even tried to sue Barry Galvin and Paul O'Brien personally for over €300 million in damages as a result of the disruption he claimed had been caused to his business by the Bureau. Bolger took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, but his pleadings unravelled when it was discovered that his paperwork was not all that it seemed to be. When Detective Sergeant Paul O'Brien and his team raided Bolger's home, they found him upstairs in an office, standing beside a shredding machine. This is what they found. It's full of shredded documents. In the best traditions of good old-fashioned police work, O'Brien and his team spent the next several weeks piecing together these shreds until he found and put together proof that Peter Bolger had been deliberately concocting false documents to fool the Dublin High Court.
They were able to show that not only were the documents false, but that Bolger on his computer had manufactured these documents. And this evidence was produced to the court and no attempt was made to countersign it. And it was described as an outrageous attempt to produce false evidence to the court. It was heavily criticised.
Whether Michael Keating was a fool or a fraud, or both, is a matter of opinion. He never had to face charges for money laundering, but the bagman's bagman couldn't explain the source of all his own wealth, and Cab hit him with a hefty tax demand.
Michael Keating's revenue affairs were investigated by the Criminal Justice Bureau, and it was found that he had issues in respect of his revenue dealings. And arising from that aspect of the investigation into Michael Keating received an assessment from the Criminal Justice Bureau. The assessment was something in the region of €600,000. He reached an agreement on the tax figure and paid something in the region of $300,000. And in order to do so, he sold his own private house in Castleknock and moved elsewhere in North County Dublin.
Michael Keating didn't do too badly out of the deal. After paying off the Bureau, he had plenty of loose change to acquire a comfortable home in Malahide, overlooking Lambay Island. Behind this facade of respectability, Keating still harbours a desire to prove his innocence. So I gave him the opportunity to come clean. I just called here to the home of Michael Keating in North County Dublin and asked him would he give us an interview about his involvement with George Mitchell and Peter Bolger. He refused. However, during our conversation, he emphasised again and again and again that his reputation has been dragged through the mud and that he's completely innocent of all the charges against him. At best, it seems bizarre that after 10 years, Michael Keating says he is still withholding the truth which can clear his name and restore his reputation.
Michael Keating, when he was in politics, showed a very lamentable lack of judgment and lack of ability to appreciate how to do things. And I think probably that lack of judgment when he was out of politics led to him getting enmeshed in things that were much more evil than he was himself. And in many ways, I would think he's been a patsy for some other people.
The swaggering Ray Burke was never accused of being anyone's patsy. Once bought, he stayed bought. But just like Michael Keating, he too was facing his day of reckoning with the Criminal Assets Bureau. In October 2002, as Ray Burke was lying low somewhere in England, the Criminal Assets Bureau swooped. His bank accounts and tax files were seized and scrutinised. Unlike the Fraud Squad inquiry in 1974, the cab now had the powers and the will to chase the money trail wherever it led. Burke could not buy or bully his way out of this quandary. In fact, he didn't even see the cab coming.
Mr. Burke would have been totally unaware of cab's involvement until the day we searched his house. It's then he would have come to the realisation that the Criminal Assets Bureau were now investigating his affairs. In total, we carried out 12 searches in Dublin City, County and Summon County Meath. Boxes and boxes of documents were seized. 2 pieces of very important evidence was seized.
One incriminating document found in Burke's house was a copy of a tax amnesty declaration. In 1993, Burke had availed of the controversial scheme that was designed to collect back taxes. He paid a measly £5,085. In return, he got a clean bill of financial health. However, CAB discovered that this was a fraudulent payment. Ray Burke should have paid over £150,000 to clear his debts to the revenue.
It was a self-assessment, and you were put on absolute trust on the basis that you were now going to come clean and pay the money and forevermore be good. He had availed of the amnesty, but hadn't availed of it honestly.
I would have described the one-page document, that is the copy of the amnesty, as the smoking gun. The investigation established that he had substantial other monies available to him outside of this jurisdiction, which he did not declare.
Making a false return is a crime. Investigators discovered that Burke had filed bogus returns throughout his 20-year period in public life. Then the Bureau uncovered another piece of the corrupt puzzle: the long-lost papers relating to his old home, Briargate, near Swords. These documents conclusively proved that the house was a kickback from the builder Tom Brennan and his associates.
The investigation more or less established that no monies, or there was an appearance that no monies changed hands between Ray Burke and Brennan McGowan concerning the purchase and development of his dwelling house at Briargate. He presented himself then for interview on a number of occasions during 2003.
Here you had one of the most powerful politicians and ex-ministers in the history of the state being questioned about impropriety. At the time when he's being questioned, he most certainly must have had a strong sense that the game was up.
He was asked on many occasions to explain the source of his wealth that was traced to foreign jurisdictions. He declined to answer the question on the advice of his solicitor.
He was, what is the mildest, unhelpful in the initial stages. He was not an easy person to deal with, and he was not cooperative. One would expect, coming from the background of public trust, that at that stage at least, that he would have come clean and assisted in the inquiries, which again would have reflected well on himself and would have prevented a further expenditure of resources in investigating his case. When he had that opportunity, he was completely uncooperative. And in fact, he was antagonistic to the officers.
Ray Burke was even more hostile to his party comrades. After Fianna Fáil found out that Burke had trousered a donation of £30,000, party officers came calling for what they believed was rightfully theirs.
When Fianna Fáil went looking for the funds Burke should have passed on to the party, he told them to